Good afternoon. I'm Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of CU. As always, I welcome both faculty, staff, and students from our own community. I welcome the diplomatic corps. Thank the ambassadors and representatives of their countries who are here. I also extend a particularly warm welcome to anybody from the Budapest community, from our academic colleagues and other institutions across Budapest, and bid you a very warm welcome to our house. I think many of you know our format. We will have a lecture for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions. And then we actually give you a drink afterwards and pogacha, and so that's in the Nader 13, just upstairs and next door to this auditorium, and I hope our conversations will continue. It's a tremendous pleasure to introduce Yascha Mounk, and I will do so a little bit more. Let me just frame this a bit. I asked Yascha to come here in part because of the enormous impact of his recent book, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, a book that's been reviewed all over the world and has galvanized a kind of debate, a debate in which if you happen to be in Budapest, you feel you're at the absolute epicenter of a global debate. And so it's wonderful to have him here, and I hope we'll have things to say to him about what he needs to understand about being here. I asked him to talk in part because one of the things I wanted to do was to begin to get us as a community, and this will be developed more in 2019, to think about reasons for hope. Change the question. Begin to ask, not simply diagnose the malaise in liberal democracy and liberal freedom, diagnose the malaise in Europe, diagnose the malaise here, there, and everywhere, but to begin to think about what are the grounded reasons why we can begin to see a future that we could shape together. Reasons for hope is important because it's easy to be generally optimistic. I'm a Canadian, so it's easy as pie. You're just preternaturally optimistic because you had the great good fortune to be born in a country that has been dealt a lot of very easy cards, so it's easy to be optimistic. Having reasons for hope is a more austere demand. And in some countries, having reasons for hope is harder than in other countries. So in the next couple of months, we will have a number of speakers who will be talking about reasons for hope, and we're kind of beginning informally tonight with a lecture with Yascha. Two further remarks about his work. I can't introduce him without noticing two things about his work that struck me with the force of a mallet on my head. One of them is that he's globally associated with a very important social science finding, which is that faith in democracy is eroding particularly among millennials, among the younger generation. So that one of the things we need to think about hard, and if you're in a position in a university, that is a finding that does hit you over the head with the force of a mallet. How is that happening? Why is that happening? What can be done about it? So that is one thing that I take from Yascha, being hit over the head with that mallet. The other thing that hit me over the head very, very strikingly in the recent book, and I hope we will talk about it, is that you're unsparing about some of the weaknesses of liberal democracy. That is the erosion of liberal democracy's institutions. I speak feelingly about this because I put my name on a ballot and was elected to a parliamentary assembly, and all I'll say is I've never been in an emptier place in my life, a more pointless place. to a degree that should be shocking to citizens, what happens in parliamentary assemblies is empty, vacant. There's nobody there. There's no there in a way that I think ought to concern everybody who loves democracy, as I think many of us do. Secondly, an allied point, the enormous growth of the regulatory state. A tremendous amount of decisions that once were taken by democratic deliberation are being taken by a regulatory state that has grown in size in every liberal democracy since 1945, diminishing the space in which citizens have effective choice. And one of the strongest features of your work to me was that emphasis on, the problem isn't simply a bunch of populists. The problem is the deep erosion of the institutions that we love and had faith in since 1945. I must now not abuse my position as chairman further and simply tell you what a pleasure it is to introduce Yascha Mounk, lecturer in political theory at the Department of Government at Harvard University, author of The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And the title that he's given to this lecture is wonderful. It's called The Delayed End of History, The Crisis of Liberal Democracy, and the Resilience of Liberal Ideals. Please give a warm welcome to Yascha Mounk.
Thank you. So I grew up not too far from here in Germany, but my parents were raised in socialist Poland. And so when I was a little kid, I spent many hours very confused as my parents and relatives told jokes about socialist Poland around the kitchen table. And I didn't understand most of those jokes, in part because until this day, my knowledge of minor political figures in Poland of the 1950s and 1960s is limited. And in part because these jokes had a sort of sense of hopelessness and of helplessness that, having had the luck of growing up in a liberal democracy, I couldn't quite relate to. But there is one particular joke that I've been thinking about quite a bit for the last few years, and it's relatively straightforward, so I want to share it with you before I talk about serious things. It's about a man who walks home from work late at night. It's a long walk, it's cold, and he's nearly back at his apartment when off in the distance he sees another guy who's visibly completely drunk throwing up into the gutter. And as soon as he sees that guy, a big smile appears on his face, and he walks over to him and he puts a hand on his shoulder and he says, "I completely agree with your political analysis, comrade." So I think that joke is particularly fitting for newly mid-American as I am, looking at what's going on in the United States with Donald Trump. It may also be particularly fitting for the community that's assembled here today for reasons that I don't have to spell out. But what I want to do today, precisely because Michael is right, that we need to move beyond just saying what is populism and what are the causes for the rise of populism, and if you want to hear about all of that, please go and read my book. But I think we need to go a little bit beyond that conversation. And so what I'm trying to do today is to reflect on the kind of historical moment we're in and what it allows us to know or to speculate about what the future of freedom and the future of liberal democracy might be. I think it's clear that we're emerging from a very triumphalist age, that many of the assumptions that most of us would still have had as recently as 3 or 5 years ago have turned out to be naive. And the temptation is to run in the opposite direction. I'm somebody who's known or was known as an alarmist in certain ways. I think at this point everybody is alarmist. The thesis that earned me the title of being an alarmist, namely that liberal democracy is in real danger in many countries in the world, have now become common sense. But I fear that there may be a danger that we start going in the other direction, and that we start concluding that liberal democracy is doomed, that the hold of these ideals is giving up its ghost, that the forces of authoritarianism are inexorably on the march. So instead of concluding that, I want to do what's most difficult, which is to sort of grapple with a historical moment that's in flux in order to try and figure out what we can know and what we can't know. And so I'm going to be asking 2 guiding questions today. The first is what is living and what is dead in liberal democracy, and the other is just a different formulation of the same question. It's what's our best guess as to the future of this political system? And to do that, I'm going to be talking in 3 parts. The first is to try and understand the triumphalist philosophy of history to which most of us have subscribed until recently. The second is to examine in a little bit of detail the 3 big challenges to that triumphalist vision of history that have emerged over the last years. And then the third is to lay out what I see as the basic scenarios for the future that are consistent with the facts as we know them. All right. So as you know, there's a big literature that's grown up in the last year or 2 on the crisis of liberal democracy. And a lot of these books frame a lot of the discussion around a rejection and sometimes a slightly glib and smug rejection of Francis Fukuyama's theory of the end of history. I know that's the case because my book does that too. But I think that there's something about Fukuyama's thesis which made it so influential that it's worth grappling with and it's worth understanding because it'll help to demarcate how we should change our mind from what it was a few years ago. So the first point to make for everybody who hasn't actually read the essay, and I encourage everybody to go and read The End of History, is that the word end in that essay has a double meaning. It does in certain ways mean what most people think it means, which is to say it is the ending of history. But primarily he meant the purpose of history, in a Hegelian sense, where history is headed. And so he recognized, of course, that there would still be historical events, even after the end of history has been realized. In the very nice phrase in the essay, he said that this is not to say that there will no longer be events to fill the pages of foreign affairs as yearly summaries of international relations. For the victory of liberalism has occurred primarily in the realm of ideas or consciousness and is as yet incomplete in the real or material world. So what he meant by the end of history was a victory of liberal ideals. The state that emerges at the end of history, he wrote, is liberal insofar as it recognizes and protects through a system of law man's universal right to freedom, and democratic insofar as it exists only with the consent of the governed. So the basic theory here is that there's a couple of very basic needs that humans have that they prioritize. They increase security, they increase absence of the more extreme forms of economic want. But once people are relatively affluent, once they are no longer afraid of getting their head bashed in the day-to-day, they really strive to achieve and realize 2 ideals. And they are the constituent elements of our political system, of liberal democracy. So the first is individual freedom. They want to live in a country in which they get to decide what to say or not say, which God to worship or whether to worship at all, how to lead their private lives. And the second thing that they want is a form of collective self-determination, that there isn't a military general or a priest or a monarch or a dictator, whether he be elected or not, who tells them what they should do, but rather that they, through some collective mechanism, decide on their own political fate. And so taking this together, I think it implies 2 basic hypotheses, which are the mechanisms behind the end of history. And Fukuyama is not actually very specific about what they are. But I think you can sort of deduce them. And these 2 basic hypotheses are, first of all, that when people have achieved liberal democracy, when they live in a system that affords them these great goods, then they value and cherish them. And they want to defend them. They are aware of their importance. And secondly, that if they don't have them, if they live in a system where they don't have to worry about the security and they're not dirt poor, but they have a dictator, they have somebody who tells them what to do, somebody who infringes on their individual liberty, They won't stand for that. They will try and move, however difficult it may prove, that country towards being a liberal democracy. That, I think, are the core contentions of Fukuyama that I want to put out for evaluation in the rest of the talk. Now, one of the things that strikes me and one of the things that makes me a little angry when people dismiss Fukuyama too glibly is that there's particularly a lot of social scientists, and I know that this university is full of great social scientists, who look down on Fukuyama while they actually have a very similar view. I grew up when I was doing my PhD with people sort of slightly laughing at the idea of the end of history. And then I took the comparative politics field seminar, and what was the major text on democratization? It was a text by Fernando Limongi and Adam Przeworski written in the 1990s, which essentially argued the same thing. It argued that once you had a GDP per capita of about $14,000 a year, once you'd had a couple of changes of government for free and fair elections, you were safe. No more reason to worry about the stability of your liberal democracy. The only real difference, so far as I can see, between Fukuyama's version of the end of history and what you might call the social science version, or the political science version, TM, of the end of history, is that in the latter, at least in the paper by Limongi and Przeworski, there's a slightly different mechanism. What they said is that essentially dictatorships collapse at random, just because they don't tend to be very stable regimes. Some of them attempt to build a democracy. And the reason why more rich countries are democracies than poor countries is not that dictatorships democratize as they get richer. It's that as countries randomly try out democracy, the ones that are affluent manage to maintain it, whereas the poor ones tend to collapse. So that is the political science version of the end of history, and that too implies a very optimistic version of the philosophy of history. If you take Limongi and Przeworski seriously, you think, at the very least, that there's a zone of safety. That Western Europe and North America and Australia and Japan and perhaps South Korea will forevermore be democracies. And then over time, as the world becomes richer, and as some countries randomly try on democratic clothes, some of them will be rich enough to stick it out. And so over time, the zone of democracy will expand. So that's the second theory that I want to put up for consideration today, the second version of the end of history. Now, as we all know, over the past years, there's been a series of challenges to our triumphalism. If you think of the end of history as the paradigm of normal science, in the words of Thomas Kuhn, then we've kept seeing anomalies crop up, cases that didn't go the way that they were supposed to. So let's take those cases and assess just how much damage they've done to the theory we're assessing. The first set of challenges comes in the form of the so-called democratic recession. Larry Diamond at Stanford University has coined that very nice phrase, and it refers to the fact that when you look at the big cross-national indicators of a state of democracy, at things like Freedom House, for example, you see that in the last years things haven't looked very bright. On the Freedom House data for each of the last 13 years, more countries have moved away from democracy than have moved towards it. Now that's obviously a very bad thing in itself. When you look at a country like Kenya making real steps back from democracy, that's something that should concern us all normatively. But I don't know how much of a challenge to the basic idea of the end of history it is, because it actually is consistent with another major theory in the field, but doesn't really stand in conflict with it. And that's, of course, the basic notion that Huntington developed of waves of democratization. And it's perfectly possible to understand, to interpret the democratic recession we've seen over the last 13 years as nothing more than a reverse wave. Democracy had extended in the late 80s and the early 90s into all kinds of countries that weren't quite affluent enough, that didn't quite have the democratic traditions to sustain those institutions. And as the international environment has become a little bit more hostile, those are being put to the test. And in some countries, democracy will stick it out. In some other countries, it won't stick it out. But that's just a normal phenomenon that we've seen for the last 150 years. It is a part of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that actually will lead us towards a more democratic future. That's the most optimistic way of reading the democratic recession. I don't know that it's true. I fear that it's not. But in order to find that out, we have to look not at all of the countries, not just at one aggregate quantitative measure, but rather at those countries that were meant to be safe, those countries in which we can really put the end of history to the test. And that is, in the first instances, the countries where democracy was supposed to be consolidated. So let's go to the second challenge to a triumphalist view of history. And that comes, I think, through public opinion data. It comes from the fact that when you look in the United States at the views of older Americans born in the 1930s and 1940s, over 2/3 say that it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy. Once you look at younger Americans born since 1980, less than 1/3 do. This challenge consists in the fact that according to a poll that was just taken a couple of weeks ago, 51% of Americans say that they have faith in US democracy. 46% of Americans say that they've lost faith, where they've never had faith to begin with in US democracy. This challenge consists in the fact that this is not just data about the United States, but that you see similar things across Europe as well, including an actual openness to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. In Germany, where I grew up 20 or so years ago, 1 in 6 Germans said that a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections was a good thing. Now it's 1 in 3. In France and the United Kingdom, it used to be 1 in 4. According to the latest data, it's 1 in 2. Every second citizen of France, every second citizen of the United Kingdom who says that a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections is a good idea. Now, this set of data points, I think, is quite a fundamental challenge to the first of those hypotheses in Fukuyama that we talked about. I think it does fundamentally undermine one of his underlying assumptions. Apparently, there are a good number of people who do have a great privilege of living in a liberal democracy who start to take its blessings for granted, who no longer give great importance to that, who focus more on the negative sides of our political system, which undoubtedly exist, rather than the positive ones that they no longer really perceive. When I talk about this, I always have to think about David Foster Wallace's lovely joke about 2 fish that meet in the sea. And the older fish runs into a younger fish and says, "Oh, good morning, how's the water today?" And the younger fish says, "What water?" There seems to be something like that going on in some liberal democracies, and it does, I think, undermine one of the motivating mechanisms that we talked about, and it also undermines in a similar way one of the core assumptions of a political science version of the end of history. Because according to that, the way that you actually recognize a consolidated democracy, the kind of way it looks like, is that democracy becomes, in one of the most famous phrases in the literature, the only game in town. Well, I think in a country in which people are increasingly open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, in which nearly 50% of people say, "I've lost faith in democracy," we can no longer say that democracy is the only game in town. Now, the third challenge to liberal democracy is both the most obvious and the most serious one. In his famous 1946 speech, Winston Churchill spoke about an iron curtain that's descending across the heart of Europe, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Well, today you can drive along that iron curtain via Poland and Hungary and Austria, down to Italy, and you can carry on all the way down to Bari on the west or all the way down to Athens in the east, and never leave a country that's ruled by authoritarian populists. We've seen that in the year 2000, the average vote share for populist parties in Europe was about 8%. By the end of this year, it will be about 26%. Authoritarian populists now rule some of the major countries in the world: the United States, Brazil, Italy, Turkey, India. And they are actually attacking the reality of liberal democracy. The thing that they have in common is not necessarily one ideology. It's not to hate Muslims or hate anybody who's not a Muslim. It's not to want to expand the welfare state or to slash it. You can find populists who have all kinds of views on all of those things. But it is that they have a notion of politics that is inimical to the very possibility of a liberal democracy. Because what populists have in common is that they say that the only real reason why we have political problems right now is that the political elite is corrupt or self-serving. That what we need to do in order to fix that is for somebody who truly stands for the real people to be elected. And the important claim that they make is not just that they do a better job or that there's something wrong with the current government or the government doesn't sufficiently care for a lot of people. That's all a normal part of politics. But what they say is that they alone stand for the people. And that therefore anybody who disagrees with them doesn't just have a legitimate political disagreement, they're doing something that shouldn't be allowed. They are deeply morally corrupt. They are dangerous. And so as we're seeing in the form of Donald Trump in the United States or of Viktor Orban here in Hungary, it's that once they get elected, they call the opposition traitors. They say that the free media are spreading fake news and need to be regulated and controlled, and often they succeed in doing that. They say that judges are the enemies of the people. Now, in the first instance, that's an attack on the liberal side of liberal democracy. The first thing you tend to get is attacks on unpopular minorities and the freedoms they enjoy. The second thing that happens is an attack on the rule of law. You see law enforcement agencies coming under the control of the executive. You see them substitute the top personnel in the country's major courts. You see them staffing the country's electoral commission with their own cronies. You see them change and gerrymander the political system in order to favor themselves. And once they've done all of that, the attack starts to be on democracy itself. Because under those conditions, it is no longer possible for the opposition to do its job and to have a fair chance of actually winning an election. A democratically elected president or prime minister can then no longer be removed from office by democratic means. So what you get in those circumstances is a movement from liberal democracy to illiberal democracy. And then in a second step, it turns out that a liberal democracy is but a way station on the path to an elected dictatorship. And I'm not an expert on Hungarian politics, but it seems to me that that is the stage that this country has now reached. But that, of course, disproves, in a fundamental way, the political science version of the end of history. Because Hungary actually has more than $14,000 GDP per capita. It's had way more than 2 changes of government for free and fair elections since 1989. And so the elections that we saw in Hungary earlier this year were not just the nth time that the same guy got re-elected in, a relatively small and insignificant country somewhere in Central Europe. It was what my parents in their socialist schools would have been taught to call a world historical event, because it has proved the basic political science theory that there was a zone of democratic safety. But has that election and have these developments also disproven Fukuyama's theory of the end of history? Do they actually undermine both of those mechanisms that I talked about earlier? Not necessarily. What's obvious is that citizens in some countries that already enjoy liberal democracy may be willing to risk it, to get rid of it, to allow that other people undermine it. And that certainly is a disappointment that qualifies the theory in an important way. Somebody writing in 1988 predicted this. The end of history, they wrote, will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called for daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In the post-historical period, there will neither be art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of a museum of human history. I can feel in myself and see in others around me a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. Such nostalgia, in fact, will continue to fuel competition and conflict even in the post-historical world for some time to come. For I recognize its inevitability, I have the most ambivalent feelings for the civilization that has been created in Europe since 1945 with its North Atlantic and Asian offshoots. Perhaps this very prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started once again. The name of the author of these lines was, of course, Francis Fukuyama, at the very end of his essay on the end of history. So Fukuyama himself foresaw, and I think we've now seen that dark prophecy come true, that his first hypothesis may not prove to be entirely right. But what about the second hypothesis? Will people strive to realize those values? Will they come to fight for individual freedom and collective self-determination in countries where they don't have it, or in countries where they lose it? That's the question that I want to answer in the last part of my talk. So I think the facts that I've laid out are consonant with three quite different scenarios. And since I've learned that I tend to have a depressing effect on people when I talk about this topic, I'm going to take you through them from most pessimistic to most optimistic. So I promise there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So the first is the possibility that we're simply at the end of the long democratic century. We've always wanted to believe that the thing that really made people Democrats was ideational, that it was a reasoned acceptance of the deep value of those ideals, that the experience of communism and of fascism gave people a principled attachment to the noble ideals of individual freedom and of collective self-determination. But I think that there may be some reasons to doubt that, because there was a lot of external inducement to endorse liberal democracy for the last 120 or so years. Since the late 19th century, the cumulative GDP of liberal democracies was higher than that of autocracies. For virtually all of that period, the countries in the world that afforded their individual citizens the best quality of life were democracies. At the height of the Soviet Union's economic competitiveness, people in that country enjoyed 60% of the GDP per capita of an average American. So to choose liberal democracy was also to choose in a country that was incommensurably richer, in which you had many more opportunities. In part because of those facts, liberal democracies have, except for very brief moments of contestation, enjoyed military dominance in the world for over 100 years, ensuring that despite occasional humiliations in less important undertakings, they weren't invaded and destroyed, they weren't militarily humiliated. And finally, all of this gave liberal democracies tremendous soft power. The most watched movies, the most admired stars, the best universities in the world for the last 100 years were located in liberal democracies. Well, none of these things are straightforwardly true anymore, or will likely be true in the coming decades. Depending on how exactly you make the calculations, this year or next year marks the point at which the cumulative GDP of authoritarian countries surpasses that of liberal democracies. We're seeing, as a very recent headline in the New York Times put it, the rise of a Chinese dream. There is now a whole vast area of China along the coast of about 200 million people in which the average GDP per capita matches that of the European Union. There's obviously the rise of a real military rival to Western liberal democracies, and particularly the United States and China. But perhaps even more interestingly and even more importantly, there is the rapid rise of authoritarian soft power as well. Some of the largest internet companies in the world are Chinese. The biggest infrastructure program is Chinese. 10 years ago, the number of universities in the top 200 that were located in authoritarian countries was 0. Now it's already in the double digits. And some of the best universities located in authoritarian countries are rapidly rising in the league tables. And no, I'm not talking about Central European University. So this raises the possibility of a very bleak future. Perhaps some of the countries in the traditional heartlands of liberal democracy are rapidly deconsolidating. And perhaps as the global prestige of liberal democracy fades, those countries that see random collapses of authoritarian regimes, which will surely continue even in the new century, aren't going to try and establish liberal democracies. They'll simply try different forms of authoritarian regime, or simply try to substitute their existing dictator for a different one. That's the most pessimistic theory, and I don't think we can exclude it from what we know so far. But there are two more optimistic ones as well. The second is the possibility that what we're about to encounter is the great migration of democracy. One of the basic questions I ask myself in my book is why it is that democracy was so stable for so long and is now no longer stable. And there's a lot of plausible answers, some of which I give in my book and some of which I don't. They include social media, demographic and cultural change, the failure of elites, supply-side factors about the congealing of populism as an alternative ideology. But I do think that one is underrated, and it's the stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens in many of the long-standing democracies. I think it's very striking that in many of the countries in which democracy ultimately took hold, it took hold after a period of very rapid economic growth. Whether it's a Wirtschaftswunder, the Tronc Glorieuse, the Miracolo Italiano, it was those moments in which citizens saw the very life world transformed in the course of a generation. And so as a result, when you talk to them in 1970, 1975, they didn't look to the national capitals, they didn't look to their political leaders as great paragons of moral virtue. But they said, you know what, they seem to be sticking to their end of the deal, so let's give them the benefit of it. And that benefit of a doubt is now rapidly eroding. And it makes me speculate, and this really is pure speculation, whether liberal democracy is only possible under the extreme economic circumstances we've recently had. during the very brief period of human development in which we see a giant rapid leap, in which life expectancy goes up significantly for every generation, in which we invent antibiotics and so on and so forth. And if that is true, then perhaps the conditions for this extreme unusual output legitimacy existed in what we now consider the heartlands of liberal democracy for 50 or so years and is now starting to fade. But perhaps it will exist in the coming century in countries of which we're not thinking at the moment. So perhaps the heartland of democracy will migrate from countries like Germany and the United States to countries like India and Nigeria and so on. This is my flight of fancy. Okay, what about the third, the most optimistic scenario, the possibility of the resurgence of liberal democracy? Well, this has two parts. The first is to argue that liberal democracy may prove more resilient than many of us fear at the moment in some of the democratic heartland. We have seen where the path of populism takes us in countries like Venezuela and Turkey and Russia, and to a great extent in Hungary as well. But even though I think we can confidently say at this point that people like Matteo Salvini in Italy or Donald Trump in the United States are cut of the same cloth, that the first steps they have taken are the same as the first steps taken by people like Orban and Erdogan, we don't know that they're going to reach the same destination, that steps 1 and steps 2 and step 3 will also imply step 9 and step 10 in those different contexts. Because, of course, those countries are quite a bit more affluent. They're not just above $14,000 GDP per capita, they're twice and more of that level. They have a much longer democratic history. They don't have 4 or 5 changes of government for free and fair election. They have 30 or 40 in some cases. Some of them are a lot more federal, which is something that people don't talk about a lot, but which may actually matter, makes it much harder for a prime minister or president to actually effectively gain control before the opposition can reassemble. And in a lot of the polls that I've looked at, they do still retain somewhat more positive attitudes towards democracy than in those more new-fledged democracies that have experienced real problems. You know, I think back to something that we don't spend enough time sort of trying to think through because it's not of the same importance. But I don't think the political scientists have a good explanation for why in the late 90s and early 2000s, center-left governments were in power in virtually every democracy in the world. I don't think there's a good theory for why it is at that particular historical juncture that in countries that are so dissimilar to each other, the center-left somehow has this moment. And of course, that moment faded eventually. And we don't really understand why that happened either. So in my most optimistic moments, I wonder whether there may be an analogy here with populism. Whether perhaps there's some set of factors that we haven't entirely understood despite our best efforts for why this is a populist moment. And perhaps there's a related set of factors that will eventually make this populist moment play itself out. My instinct is not that this is the case. I argue against it to some extent in my book, but I think we can't discount it as a possibility. All right, so to end the talk, let me talk about countries that will hit closest to home for you. What about not the countries in which populists are trying to undermine liberal democratic institutions at the moment, like Italy or the United States, but about countries in which they have substantively succeeded in doing so? What is the future of Hungary as a society? Well, I think it's important to remember that in its first years, dictatorships tend to enjoy a significant amount of charismatic authority, as Max Weber would have called it. But the fact of being newly established, the fact of having a credible and charismatic leader who's popular among large segments of population does a lot for a fledgling dictatorship. It gives it the benefit of a doubt. And as a result, those people who are at the forefront of trying to fight for free institutions might feel the brunt of his anger, might see their institutions shut down. But most citizens don't actually notice what's going on. They can go about their lives. They complain about something to their friend that doesn't have consequences. The economy is chugging along. But that charismatic authority, as we've seen in one dictatorship after another, is eventually used up. It's either used up because the charismatic leader himself falls out of favor, perhaps because he's been around too long, and as any politician knows, once you've been around too long, people eventually tire of you. Perhaps there's a problem of succession, where they pass away or have health problems or become too old to rule, and the successor does not have the same legitimacy as we're seeing in a place like Venezuela at the moment. Or perhaps it is, to cite once again this paper by Lemonje and Chavorsky, a kind of external shock. Perhaps there's an economic crisis or a corruption scandal or something else from the outside that creates a moment of crisis. Well, what happens in that moment of crisis is a loss of legitimacy, in which more people grow unhappy, perhaps the protests swell. And the way that dictators tend to deal with a problem of loss of legitimacy is to ratchet up the repression. But the more repression there is, the more it starts to touch ordinary people. The more the remaining legitimacy of the system starts to give away. And so you start to enter a vicious cycle, in which a loss of legitimacy leads to an increase of repression, and an increase of repression leads to a loss of legitimacy. Hungary and your neighbors in Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, have a lot of experiences of this. These were the transitions that those countries went through in 1956, here in Hungary in 1968, in much of the rest of the former Warsaw Bloc. And so the question is, what happens at that point? I think the past years have shown that many Hungarians, and many people in Poland, and many people in Turkey, and many people in many societies around the world, are willing to go along with a regime that claims to preserve individual freedom and collective self-determination while actually destroying it. But over time, it will inevitably become more and more clear to a greater and greater number of people that they're no longer free, that they no longer do enjoy collective self-determination. And at that point, I think it's likely that they'll try to rebel. Now, the outcome of that rebellion is unsure. 1956 and 1968 teach us that as well. But the basic motor of the end of history has not yet been disproven, or one of the two basic positive motors. We don't yet know how people react when they're in relatively affluent societies, don't have to fear for their lives every day, and they've understood that we no longer enjoy individual freedom and collective self-determination. And my hope and my bet is that at that point, they will act as Fukuyama predicted and try and recreate and fight again for those basic values. Thanks.